A man from the next valley over has just killed your brother. You know exactly who he is. You know where he sleeps, you know the path he walks to the river, and you know his name. There are no police to call. There is no court, no judge, no prison, no report to file. There is only you, your family, and the raw, unspoken expectation that something now has to happen. So what do you actually do? Do you strike back tonight? Do you wait? Do you gather the men of your camp, or do you let it go and live with the shame? This is not a thought experiment. For the overwhelming majority of the human story, this was the situation. No institutions, no written law, no third party with the authority to punish anyone on your behalf. And yet the popular picture of how ancient humans handled their enemies swings wildly between two cartoons. In one, they were peaceful, gentle, egalitarian foragers who barely knew what violence was until agriculture and greed ruined everything. In the other, they were bloodthirsty savages locked in a permanent, brutal war of all against all. Both of these pictures are wrong. Both of them are comforting in different ways, and both of them completely miss what the evidence actually shows. So here's the real question, the one this whole video is going to unravel. How did human beings, for hundreds of thousands of years, manage conflict without any of the machinery we now take completely for granted? Because when you strip away the government, the laws, and the institutions, you do not get chaos. You get something else. You get a set of solutions, invented over and over again across the planet, by people who never met each other, who spoke different languages, who lived in completely different environments, and who nonetheless kept arriving at the same handful of answers. Those answers tell you something uncomfortable about what human beings really are. Let's start by killing the first myth, the gentle one, because it's the more popular one right now. The idea that pre-state humans lived in harmony until civilization corrupted them is emotionally appealing and archaeologically difficult to defend. Consider a site called Nataruk, in what is now Kenya, dated to around 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists uncovered the skeletons of at least 27 people. Some had crushed skulls. One had a projectile point still lodged in the skull. Several had their hands positioned as though they had been bound. A pregnant woman was among the dead. This was not an accident. This was not a burial. This was, by every reasonable reading of the bones, a massacre. Nataruk is not alone. The Talheim death pit in Germany, dated to the early Neolithic, held the remains of dozens of men, women, and children, most of them killed by blows to the back of the head, apparently as they tried to flee. At Crow Creek in South Dakota, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of people who were killed, scalped, and mutilated before the survivors could even finish building the defensive ditch around their village. So no, ancient humans were not living in some untouched paradise of universal peace. Violence between groups is old. It is deep. It shows up on every inhabited continent, long before kings, armies, or states existed. But here's where the second myth, the brutal one, falls apart just as fast. Because if you actually add up how ancient humans spent their time, they were not fighting constantly. The image of a permanent, grinding war of all against all is just as false as the peaceful paradise. Full-scale conflict was rare, dangerous, and enormously costly. When you live in a small group with no doctors, no antibiotics, and no way to replace a lost hunter, a single death is a catastrophe. You cannot afford to lose people casually, and that single fact, the sheer cost of a dead body, shaped almost everything about how ancient humans actually dealt with their enemies. To understand the real toolkit, you have to think like a person with everything to lose. And the first and oldest tool in that kit is not the spear, it is the threat of the spear. Anthropologists who study small-scale societies notice something over and over again. An enormous amount of conflict is managed through reputation, through posturing, through the loud and public promise of retaliation. Your safety did not come from a police force. Your safety came from everyone around you knowing, with absolute certainty, that if they harmed you or yours, your kin would come for them. Deterrence was the entire security system, and deterrence only works if it is believed. This is why so much ancient conflict looks, to modern eyes, almost theatrical. Across societies in New Guinea, the Amazon, and Aboriginal Australia, ethnographers documented forms of ritualized fighting, where two groups would line up, shout insults, throw spears from a distance, and often disperse the moment one or two people were actually wounded. To us, that looks like a failed battle. It was nothing of the kind. It was a controlled release of pressure. It let both sides display their strength, honor their dead, and re-establish deterrence, all without the demographic disaster of a full-scale slaughter that neither group could truly afford. Deterrence has a dark twin, and its name is the feud. When someone was actually killed and negotiation failed, the obligation to retaliate could lock two families or two groups into a cycle that lasted for generations. You kill one of mine, I kill one of yours, and now your side owes another death, and it never truly ends. Among the Yanomami of the Amazon, anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon documented exactly this kind of chronic, revenge-driven violence, where a substantial share of adult men had participated in a killing, and where raids and counter-raids formed a grim, self-perpetuating rhythm of community life. Now, Chagnon's work is genuinely controversial, and it should be. Critics argue he overstated the violence, that his presence and his trade goods distorted the very thing he was measuring, and that the Yanomami are not some frozen window into the deep past. All of that is fair. But the broader pattern he described, the blood feud as a self-sustaining engine of conflict, is not unique to the Amazon. It shows up in the sagas of medieval Iceland, in the highlands of Albania, in the clans of ancient Arabia. Wherever there is no higher authority to impose justice, the feud tends to appear. It is a human default, not a regional accident. So if the feud was such a disaster, and it was, how did ancient humans stop it? Because they clearly did. Groups did not simply spiral into extinction through endless revenge. They developed breaks, and the most powerful break of all was not a weapon, it was a payment. Across an astonishing range of cultures, people invented systems where a killing could be settled not with another killing, but with the transfer of valuable goods to the family of the victim. Anthropologists call it compensation, or blood money, and it is one of the most widespread conflict resolution technologies in the entire human record. Think about how radical that idea actually is. It requires everyone involved to agree that a human life can be translated into a quantity of cattle, or shells, or copper, or silver, and that accepting that payment ends the obligation to kill. The Anglo-Saxons had a word for it, vergild, literally man price, with a formal scale setting the value of a life according to a person's rank. Somali customary law has diya. Islamic law codified diya directly. In each case, the logic is identical. Give the aggrieved family a path to satisfaction that does not require blood, and you give the whole community a way out of a cycle that would otherwise consume it. This points to something people rarely appreciate about ancient conflict. An enormous amount of it was settled through negotiation, through intermediaries, and through what we would now call diplomacy. There were people whose social role was precisely to move between hostile groups and broker peace. Neutral parties, respected elders, individuals with kin on both sides who could carry messages without being killed for it. Marriage itself was often a peace treaty written in flesh. You give a daughter to a rival group, and suddenly the children of your enemy share blood with your own grandchildren, and killing becomes far more complicated. Gift-giving worked the same way, and it was everywhere. In many societies, the line between trade, tribute, and truce was deliberately blurry. You gave your rivals lavish gifts, not out of pure generosity, but because a group that owes you, or that has feasted at your fire, is a group less likely to raid you at dawn. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss built an entire theory around this, the idea that the gift is never truly free, that it always carries an obligation to reciprocate. And that obligation, that invisible thread of debt running between two groups, was often stronger than any wall. It bound enemies into relationships they could not easily walk away from. But let's be honest about the darkest tool in the kit, because we can't skip it. Sometimes the goal was not to deter an enemy, not to compensate them, and not to marry into them. Sometimes the goal was to erase them. The archaeological massacres we opened with were not feuds, and they were not rituals. They were attempts to wipe out an entire rival group in a single strike, women and children included. And the grim logic behind that is chillingly rational within its own frame. If you leave survivors, you leave people with a blood debt. People who will grow up, remember, and come back for you. This is the terrible arithmetic that sat underneath the worst ancient violence. In a world with no institution to guarantee your safety, a surviving enemy was a permanent, walking risk. And so, total elimination, however monstrous it looks to us, was a recurring strategy precisely because partial victory could be more dangerous than no victory at all. Understanding this is not the same as excusing it, but it does explain why the same species that invented blood money and peace marriages also, again and again, produced mass graves. The peaceful tools and the annihilating ones were not opposites. They were two answers to the exact same problem. Now we arrive at the twist, the part that reframes everything you've just heard. Because when you lay all of these tools side by side, deterrence, ritual combat, the feud, compensation, marriage, gift-giving, annihilation, you start to notice they are not a random assortment. They are a spectrum, and the thing that determined where a group landed on that spectrum was almost never cruelty or kindness. It was cost. It was the cold calculation of what a given group could afford to do, given how many people they had, how much they needed their neighbors, and how much they stood to lose. Think about what that means. The same people who would trade with a neighboring band one season might raid them the next, not because their character changed, but because the circumstances did. A drought, a failed hunt, a rival group growing too powerful, a killing that could not be paid off. Human beings did not divide the world into permanent friends and permanent enemies, the way our stories often pretend. The category of enemy was fluid. It shifted with conditions. And the ability to move an enemy into the category of ally, or an ally into the category of enemy, was itself a survival skill, maybe the most important one of all. And here's the uncomfortable part. That machinery did not disappear. You carry it. The same instincts that made an ancient forager size up a stranger, calculate whether he was a threat or a resource, and file him instantly into a category, those instincts are still running inside your skull right now. The speed at which you form an impression of an outsider, the ease with which your mind sorts people into us and them, the way a shared meal or a shared gift can soften a rival almost against your will, none of that is modern. All of it is inheritance. The genes remember even when the courts and the laws pretend otherwise. This is why our modern systems, the police, the courts, the prisons, the treaties, feel at once so powerful and so fragile. They are, in a sense, an enormous, elaborate attempt to take the job that used to belong to your kin and hand it to strangers in uniforms and robes. We outsourced the feud to the state. We replaced blood money with fines and lawsuits. We turned the peace marriage into international diplomacy. Every one of those institutions is a descendant of a solution that ancient humans invented first, with nothing but their wits, their weapons, and their desperate need to not lose the people they could not replace. When you ask how ancient humans dealt with their enemies, the honest answer is that they dealt with them the way we still do, only more nakedly, with fewer buffers between the impulse and the act. They threatened. They performed. They negotiated. They paid. They married. They forgave. And when all of that failed, they killed, sometimes on a scale that still turns up in the soil thousands of years later. They were not gentle. They were not monsters. They were something far more interesting and far more familiar. They were us, without the institutions we built precisely so we would not have to make those choices ourselves. The man from the next valley who killed your brother is still standing there, in your imagination, at the start of this video. And now you know your real options were never as simple as revenge. You could have raided. You could have postured. You could have demanded cattle. You could have offered a daughter. You could have let it go and rebuilt the peace. The choice was yours, and it was terrifying, because there was no one else to make it. That is the world we came from, and in some quiet, ancient corner of your mind, you have never entirely left it. If this is the kind of history that grabs you, the hidden logic beneath how our ancestors actually lived, fought, and survived, I've built an entire course that goes far deeper than any single video can, layer by layer, into the secret lives of ancient humans. You'll find the link in the description. Keep asking the questions nobody thinks to ask. That's where the real story always is.